mi je, da se je Miner odzval našemu povabilu, skupnemu povabilu Francoskega inštituta v Ljubljani, Društva za teoretsko psihoanalizo in festivala Fabula, in da ga smemo torej prvič gostiti v Sloveniji in prisluhniti. Seveda vas vabim tudi na ostale dogodke festivala. Nocoj v okviru festivalskega fokusa poteka v 18. kinoteki zanimiva razprava o otrocih beguncih Anica Mikuš-Kos in Mirjam Mikuš-Čekarnik. Otvoritev fotografske razstave Simone Svasen, jutri literarni večer z nizozemskim literarnim velikanom, Chrisom Notebomom, otvoritev literarni večer z kolumbijskim avtorjem Juanom Gabrielom Vázquezom in v soboto literarni zaključek z islandskim avtorjem Šionom. Vmes pa seveda še mnogo drugega, vzemite programske knjižice, izberite svoje dogodke. Jaz bi pa povabila kar profesorja Dolarja, da predstavi današnjega gosta in potem se bo predavanje začelo. Hvala.
All right, I speak English. It's a great pleasure, a great honor to have with us today Jean-Claude Miner. Jean-Claude Miner was a legendary personality. A personality who has been so much at the core in the past half a century of what has happened in France, the big intellectual event, the event of thought that happened in France during that time, which is usually labeled by not quite adequate labels of structuralism, post-structuralism, even less adequate. But anyway, since the 60s, he's been at the core of that series of events. And in the mid-60s, he was a co-founder of Cahiers pour l'Analyse, which was actually a sort of student journal. 10 issues were published at the time, but Cahiers pour l'Analyse was really a construction site, a boiling pot of theories, of concepts, at the very high day of structuralism. And this is a journal where everybody published. Lacan, Althusser, Foucault, Derrida, and all the 10 issues are still in print. Last year there was a 2-volume selection in English, which made a lot of impact. And then Jean-Claude Miner's career took a certain path in linguistics, and I must say he attended the best universities imaginable. École Normale Supérieure, which is the most prestigious university place in France, and then MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where his linguistic work, is closely associated with the work of Noam Chomsky. And then the list of his publications, there are actually 35 books. I won't even attempt to go through the whole list. I just, let me say, one can put them into 3 or 4 categories. The first one concerns his linguistic career, and there this starts with Argument linguistique, linguistic arguments in 1973, de la syntaxe et l'interprétation, syntax and interpretation in 1978, and well, a number of other works leading up to Introduction en sciences du langage in 1989, which is a sort of summing up of the linguistics of 20th century. And this is the book which you have also in Slovene translation, a shortened version, because the original version is it's a voluminous, big book. And I highly recommend it. Whoever wants to know what happened in the linguistics in 20th century, this is the book. Then there is a series of books which deal with the intersection, let's say, roughly, between linguistics on one hand and psychoanalysis and virus and structuralism. And the first extremely important book for the whole generation was L'amour de la langue, for the love of language, in 1978. And a chapter from that book was translated into Slovene in 1981. So Jean-Claude Miner has been with us for quite a while, 35 years. He's been a presence in this country. A dozen of his texts or so have been published in journals, plus 3 books. Among those, I must really point out L'Œuvre Claire, the clear work, which is the one I have here, which is translated into Slovene. which is the definitive book on, say, psychoanalysis, science, and the way Lacan's intervention into that field, the question of psychoanalysis and science. And then there's Le Périple structural, which was translated into Slovenian as structuralism some years ago, which is a sort of, again, compendium or summing up of what this current of structuralism actually was all about. Then, in the next category, there's a series of books which one might call political interventions, but in a very, very wide sense. From the L'école in 1984, schooling, which is an intervention into the pedagogical ideologies around Le Salaire de l'idéal, which is a sort of intervention into a Marxist theory of wage and surplus value. There is a series of books which caused a lot of uproar. Les penchants criminels de l'Europe démocratique, 2003, the criminal inclinations of democratic Europe. Constat, l'arrogance du présent, the arrogance of present times. Les two books, La politique des choses, the politics of things, and Politique des êtres parlants, for politics of speaking beings. So, this long series of interventions into the ambient politics, in the widest sense of the word. And then in the last part, I would say there are interventions into what? Into literary field, the field of art, something which is best captured by the title of his best book, by his last book, La puissance du détail, the power of the detail. And really he has incredible power, incredible capacity to unpack the detail, the importance of the detail. And there I must mention, okay, this Dire le Ver in 87, which is an analysis of the first structure in 17th century France. There's a book on Mallarmé, there's a book on painting, and I must mention the last two, which is a book on Harry Potter. Believe it or not, there's a book on Harry Potter. And the last one, La puissance du détail, the power of the detail, which gathers interventions, reading very particular details in various works of art in literature and philosophy. And if his presence in this country started in 81 by translation of a chapter from Louis de Langue. The last one to be published is just a few months ago, a chapter from his last book, which deals with Kafka's story on the opera. I will finish on a personal note. I had a very good fortune to be able to follow a course with Jacques-Henri Villard for a year in 1980 in Vincennes, when Vincennes was still Vincennes. It is rare in one's life that one witnesses moments of thought. Thought is rare. Thought is a very rare thing. When one witnesses it, one knows it. It's something which obliges, which engages immediately, something which, but there is sort of the emergence of the universal in the midst of a very singular situation, of course. And well, I feel very lucky that I was able to witness one such moment in my life when I was following the course by Jacques-Henri Villard in 1980. Thank you.
There just was a long list of books that I wrote. You may be interested to know that another book will be published, I suppose, in October. Its subject is the French Revolution and some others revolution. It seems to me that the notion of revolution that postmodernism in fact completely put aside has now to be reconsidered, precisely because what I call the revolutionary myth has also ceased to function. But enough with that. My intention is to examine with you some turning points in Lacan's intellectual evolution. And I shall insist on a part of Lacan's life, intellectual life, that has not been studied till recently. I mean, the first part, what he calls in his key writings, nos antécédents, our antecedents. That part is, let's say, well known, but not well studied. We know that Kojève was important, but for instance, it is only recently that a researcher named Jean-Paul Thielly has taken responsibility for publishing those letters, 5 letters to Kojève. There's, at one level, they are not interesting at all, because they're just practical, but at another level, they are very interesting, because we can deduce from these letters that in a sort of parallel way to Kojève's seminar, Lacan organized in his own apartment some, not seminar, but sort of study group with Bataille, Méris, Queneau, all people who followed, on the other hand, Kojève's seminar. But although there was an important overlapping between Kojève's audience and this study group organized by Lacan, Kojève was not present, except on invitation, and Kojève sometimes came. So that's one thing that is interesting concerning, I shall deal with that a little more, the intellectual life of Lacan and in Paris at that time. Another thing we learn is that Kojève and Lacan gave an exposé, an intervention on Hegel's doctrine theory of madness in Kojève's seminar. And from that starting point, Kojève and Lacan projected to write together a book or essay about Hegel and Freud. We knew about that, but we didn't know exactly to what extent this project was achieved. Through these letters, we understand that the project was quite serious. Jean-Paul Thielly has discovered the first part of this essay written by Kojève. he wants to publish it. I think he will. It has been published, but I'm not sure about that. He was kind enough to send it to me. I think personally that it's not interesting at all. It's just sort of rehashing of Hergé's Hegelian approach to the general question of subject. And we do not have whatever Lacan wrote or did not write about Freud and the question of madness. But nevertheless, it gives something, gives an indication. About what? I think that concerning this period, let's say 35 in Paris, we in general have a tendency to forget one very important factor. The fact is, as we know, that it was for a very short duration that intellectual activity could take place, in a free way, in Paris, since Germans arrived in 1940. So it was only 4 or 5 years of freedom. But nobody thought that at that time, everybody was convinced, not only in France, but everywhere, that the French army was the best army in the world. And so that if there was a war, Paris at least would be a free city for the whole duration of the war. And so what was beginning in 35 in Paris was conceived as destined to a duration of, let's say, a decade. All the projects, including, for instance, this project I mentioned, were conceived as having 5 or 10 years of possible development. Of course, we know that it's not true. It was not true, but at that time, that was the general conception. And from that point of view, what happens in Paris at that time, although it was so short in duration, not only was it supposed to last, but it was supposed to have a great importance for European intellectual life, or let's say Western European life in general. Because, of course, all German intellectuals, German Jewish intellectuals, but also left German intellectual emigrated from Germany. And at that time, they did not go to the United States. The United States was too far away, and in fact, it was difficult to enter. So they thought of Europe as a place to immigrate. And among the countries where they could immigrate, they could not include Italy and could not include Spain. In fact, not the only, but the most plausible possibilities were France and Great Britain, and of course that meant Paris and London. And the division was political. Right-minded, politically right-minded people, intellectuals, prefer London for instance, Lewis Paris. And left-minded prefer Paris. For instance, Hannah Arendt, for instance, Benjamin, even Brecht thought of staying in Paris. So the possibility at that time, the project was for Paris to become the intellectual capital of the progressive intellectual activity of all Europe. Not only France, of course, but also German immigration, also all Middle Eastern immigration, Italian progressive immigration, and so on and so on. This possibility was combined with a discovery Lacan was in 35, was in 34 years old. He was one of those who had just escaped the First World War. When the war was finished, he was just on the verge of being mobilized, or whatever the word is, to become a soldier. He barely escaped that. But of course, the presence of the war had been very important, and the reflection on what the war had revealed was very important. And what the First World War had revealed was the possibility, let's use the word of yesterday, of barbarous behaviors on the part of civilized countries. Bataille was one of those who reflected on that. How is it possible? And they discovered, these people of 30 years, 35 years old, they discovered that the French philosophical language was completely unable to cope with this question. You have to remember that at that time, I take two examples. The French philosophical language did not use the word dialectics and did not know the procedure, any kind of procedure that could be called dialectical. But the word itself was impossible to use. When Jacobson was translated in French, it was in the 40s, he had in paper written in German, he had written something about dialectic changes, dialectische Veränderungen, something like that. And he was surprised to discover that the translator had written dialectical changes about dialects, not dialectics. And so he pointed out is a mistake, and he said, well, not dialectal, but dialectal, but dialectic. And the translator, who was himself a very good linguist, answered that the word, in that case the adjective dialectique, was not used in French except in political tracts or pamphlets. So you have an idea of what was the French philosophical language at that time. You could not use the notion of dialectics. You could not use any argument of a dialectic type. Other example I shall take is the notion of sujet. We are accustomed to that use that I call absolute sujet without any kind of complement or any kind of epithet or qualifier. But at that time, this use was completely impossible. You could use sujet only with a complement. Sujet d'une phrase, subject of a sentence. Sujet d'une proposition, subject of a logical proposition. Sujet d'un droit, subject of a right, and so on and so on. I call that use relational or relative, relational, in a relation, as opposed to the use that is now completely ordinary, the absolute use. And of course, for Lacan, the absolute use of the word sujet is crucial, since the whole theory of sujet depends on the possibility of using sujet in an absolute sense, not in a relational sense. The sujet, Lacanian sujet, Lacanian subject, is not relatively definable. So it's crucial that it could be expressed by a non-relational expression. But the current philosophical language at that time did not know that expression. The question is, how did the French philosophical language compatible with dialectics and compatible with an absolute expression of subject? Or who was responsible for that? And in fact, the how is quite clear. The how is knowledge, not complete of course, but better knowledge, let's say, of the Hegelian tradition and the Hegelian way of expressing themselves. The who is quite clear. It's Cogère. As a person, he was giving a seminar. He was at the beginning replacing Poiret, who was supposed to be in a position outside France, and after that he became responsible by himself for a seminar in the Hautes Études. And his seminar, in fact, gave two seminars, but the one that is important for us now is a continuous commentary of the phenomenology of a mind, phénoménologie de l'esprit, phénoménologie des geistes. This has been published after the war, but I'm talking about the 7th, and the only written trace of this seminar at that time whereas the notes that were taken by Grimaud, by that guy, I don't think that Lacan took notes, or not complete notes at least, but he collected very careful attention the notes by that guy or by him. At that time, at this place, during since 35 till 39, French philosophical language changed completely. It became open to dialectics. It became open to other things, but also to an absolute use of the notion of subject. The first trace of that, of course, appears in Sartre, although Sartre did not participate to Cochet's teaching. But Simone de Beauvoir collected the notes, so the influence was there too. And you have that in the first French translation of the Philologie, done by a French philosopher called Hippolyte, who followed Cochet's seminar, and from a stylistic point of view, it's very clear that Hegel's translation by Hippolyte completely revolutionized the French philosophical language. Lacan's style of writing was very deeply influenced both by Cochet's stylistic, that is, from the French position of Hegel's stylistics, by Cochet and by Hippolyte's translation. This period, as I said, was supposed to last for 10 years, something like that. In fact, it lasted for 10 years. It appears in the Complexes Familiaux, it appears in the paper called De l'agressivité en psychanalyse, it appears in La causalité psychique, these papers that have been collected at the beginning of the year. But the fact is that even La causalité psychique and Agressivité, which are brilliant papers, or the Complexes Familiaux, 36, I think, which is a brilliant brilliant, to integrate Freud, psychoanalysis, to a larger, let's say, intellectual movement. At the end, in 48, it's very clear that it is a dead end. Lacan cannot go further. What he may be able to do is to pursue a sort of Hegelian translation, stylistically Hegelian translation of Freud concepts. But it's a dead end, because he cannot go got further than Freud, and not really further than Hegel. In fact, the papers I mentioned, Causalité psychique, Agressivité, and Psychanalyse, are brilliant. But the brilliance consists in putting together approaches that are not naturally put together. For instance, the approach of madness by modern psychiatry and the Hegelian analysis of madness in the phenomenology. With the addition that from Lacan's point of view, Hegel is nearer the Freudian approach than psychiatry. But I repeat, such a research program is not a research program anymore. It was a research program in 1936. Well, you could expect to discover new features, let's say, either in psychoanalysis or in social structures, by taking as a departure point the complex view. But with the 48 papers, you cannot expect to discover anything new. What you can expect is to find a new way of expressing already discoveries that have been already made. The new way of, new style, but not a new discovery. And in fact, I would like to insist on this point. Lacan is interested in discoveries, not in exposition or in style. Of course, you have stylistic terms, stylistic plays, but style has no importance at all. What I mean, it's important only if it is a way to make possible for French-speaking being, a French-speaking being, to go against the natural tendency of his own language and approach, let's call that a truth, a new truth, that could not be expressed by following the natural tendency of the French language. In order to do that, to express a discovery, Lacan sometimes, and more and more often, in fact, will play with expression, will use stylistic devices. But the novelty is not in the stylistic device, although the stylistic device is new. The novelty is in the core of discovery that the stylistic device makes it possible to hear or to read. I want to insist about that. There is a dimension of empirical discovery in Lacan that has been ignored by many commentaries. That's the reason why I tried in L'Œuvre Claire to present Lacan in a sort of systematic way, distinguishing the axioms, the theorems, and so on, in order to allow the perception of a real effective research program. which is not reducible to a stylistic or expression program. So what happens? What makes, let's say that agressivité, la causalité psychique, all these papers of 48 are in fact the echoes of this first paper called Les complexes familiaux. What happens that leads Lacan to turn the page? Which is also to turn the page of the Cogelian influence and the Hegelian approach. Of course, we'll still have Hegel in mind, and Cogel in mind. We'll call Cogel till the end his master, son maître. But nevertheless, the period, the 10 years period, the decade, that began with Les complexes familiaux and concluded with l'agressivité en psychanalyse, this period is dominated by the discovery of dialectics and the isolation of the absolute use of the word subject. This period is closed. What happens? What happens is the discovery of Lévi-Strauss' book, Les structures élémentaires de la parenté, elementary, I don't know how it's translated generally in English, but let's say elementary structures of kinship, something like that. The discovery should be analyzed closely. The object that Lacan, and in a certain sense, he claimed that, he would have claimed that at that time, in 36, as a discovery. The object of psychoanalysis is the individual taken in the structure of a family. The origin of the unconscious, the origin of what Freud called complex, the origin of all the data that Freudian analysis dealt with, the material origin is family. Not the individual, but the individual as taken in a family. That's the reason why Lacan gave the title Les complexes familiaux, familial complexes. That means that there are complexes in Freudian science because the subject of a complex is the subject of a family. And in order to understand that, you have to go beyond the sociological approach of family and to isolate an absolute subject from the subject of the family, or the subject of the complex, or the subject of the unconscious. And of course, dialectics are a way, the most fruitful way perhaps, to explain, to expound, to describe the relationships inside the family, inside this cell that Lacan called a family. I won't enter into the details, but they are very interesting, but it would go too far. What happens with the notion of elementary structure of kinship is that the notion of family is replaced by the notion of kinship. So, the notion of family, which was considered as a primitive datum, is considered as derived from the really primitive concept, notion, which is kinship. Family is a certain type of structuration of kinship. And on the other hand, what is relevant, given this shift from family to kinship, what is relevant is not complex, notion of complex, but the notion of elementary structure. That means what? That means that you do not take as a departure point the complex, but you take as a departure point an element. And you do not take the complex as an unanalyzed complexity, but you take it as a structure that is beforehand analyzed in its elements. That is the discovery that Lévi-Strauss enables Lacan to make. That concerns not structuralism in general, it concerns the very object of psychoanalysis. In other words, the discovery that Lacan thought he had made concerning the object of psychoanalysis, this discovery has to be rewritten entirely if Lévi-Strauss is taken seriously. Instead of complex view, you have structures élémentaires. Instead of family, you have parenté. If the primary object of psychoanalysis is rewritten by Lévi-Strauss in such a way, that means that Lévi-Strauss's approach goes far beyond ethnology or sociology. It goes to the very core of analysis itself. In psychoanalysis, in the word, the name psychoanalysis, analysis has meaning only if it is understood in the way that enables Lévi-Strauss to redefine, to rewrite the primary object of psychoanalysis. Consequently, analysis from that point is understood in a structural sense. An analysis shows the elementary structures of its object. In fact, Lacan discovered progressively that, at least my interpretation, that Lévi-Strauss didn't completely answer to the expectations. From the structure élémentaire de la parenté, Lacan had reduced a certain research program, and he thought that he could be a sort of companion, a role companion of Lévi-Strauss, to follow every step that Lévi-Strauss made in the field of anthropology, and accomplish the same step in the field of psychoanalysis. An example of that is a text called Le mythe individuel du névrosé, the individual myth of the Névrosé, which Lacan gave orally in 1953, never allowed it to be published, and it was stenographed and published recently. And the same Lucelli I talked about some minutes ago showed in a very convincing way that Lacan applies literally the formula that Lévi-Strauss gave for the myth in general. It's called a canonical form, canonical structure, canonical formula, excuse me, the canonical formula of myth. And it is a mathematical formula. But that step that Lacan was ready to make, that following enterprise that Lacan was ready to pursue, in fact, he did not find in Lévi-Strauss any desire to pursue the same project. I mean, Lévi-Strauss, it's very clear when now you see the best commentaries of Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss did not pursue the method of les structures élémentaires, elementary structure. So, Lacan was, in a certain sense, abandoned by Lévi-Strauss. And he was alone to pursue his own project. This research program was explained in the Discourse of Rome in 1953, same year as le mythe individuel du Névrosé. And progressively, Lacan gave a stricter and stricter version of the notion of structure and of the structuralist method, and much stricter than Lévi-Strauss's version. And in fact, the gap between Lévi-Strauss's structuralism and Lacan's structuralism became wider and wider. So, in 1968, let's say, just after the Cahiers pour l'analyse had been created, Lacan was what I call an hyper-structuralist. He held two claims. He had two claims. One which defined structuralism in a strict sense, that is, the property of any terms depend only on the position the term occupies in a sequence. There is no substantial properties that belong to the terms outside their position. And that allows us to define the structure. Second claim, which is hyperstructuralist, not structuralist, hyperstructuralist, is that the structure reduced at its most general formula has properties. That is, the position it defines properties that are not trivial, that are specific. So the most general structure imposes specific properties to its terms. And that is hyperstructuralist, non-structuralist. And of course, that was the version that the Cahiers d'analyse held up. And one brilliant illustration of that interpretation was given by Jacques-Alain Miller's paper, Action de la structure, which means that la structure, in its more general form, has an action, a specific action, so such that any term taken in that general structure receives specific properties from its position in the structure. Arrives 68. And Lacan will close, May 68, and Lacan will close both structuralism and hyperstructuralism. The theory of discourses, the theory des discours, the four discourses, rely on an axiom, which is terms may have properties that are independent of their position. The proof of that is the possibility of permutation between terms. That is, terms may change their position and keep some properties. They may acquire new properties from the new position, but they may keep the position they had as terms distinct from that position. That is some possibility that was not open in a structuralist approach, and it's open necessary to the theory of discourse. At the end, you even arrive to what I call the canonical, my personal appellation, the canonical formula of discourse, that is S1 and S2 versus S2. S1 as being S1, as being the first signifiant in a sequence, has substantial properties which it will keep even though it changes position in the discourse. It's called the signifiant maître, and maître is the substantial definition. It is not a formal definition. So the position of being the first S1 is structural, but the properties that the terms that occupies that position are substantial but not formal. S2 is knowledge, le savoir. And the only way, in my conception, is that in fact, maître, as maître, has to be defined independently any position. And in the second time, the second assumption is that the maître occupies the first position in the canonical formula of discourse. And of course, after that, all discourses do not follow the canonical formula, so you have variations. And knowledge, le savoir, has its own substantial features, and after these substantial features have been defined, the assumption is that the knowledge occupies the second position.